afternoon, I guess early morning for you, and Szabolcs will be talking about Orbán government's impact on international level and its political and financial aspects. So, Szabolcs, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this invitation. Can you hear me clearly? Okay, the audio. Perfect. So actually, I'm in Rome, Italy. So it's not early morning. It's actually about sunset, I guess. So what I'm going to talk about, the title is the political and financial methods of the Orbán government to increase global influence. And what I'm mostly going to focus on is what I call foreign influence operations by the Orbán government. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that. So as I'm an investigative journalist, and among other topics, I've also been following the lobbying efforts of the Orbán government since at least 2014. And I've been closely following that kind of network building that the Orbán government has been involved in from the United States to the European Union and the United Kingdom. And I'm mostly going to focus on these countries or institutions. I think that you are all aware of the fact that Viktor Orbán and the Hungarian government has an outsized presence when it comes to international media or international discourse about world affairs. And of course, this is mostly due to the fact that there are some controversial measures and developments in this country, or some remarks by the Prime Minister that do deserve reporting by journalists. But also, to some extent, the media attention and the political attention is due to the fact that the Orbán government has been pouring billions of forints into a foreign influence machine. I wouldn't call this Hungarian soft power, because soft power usually means that a country is trying to depoliticize its image, trying to, covered way, extend its influence by hiding behind, I don't know, culture, gastronomy, history, arts. But what the Hungarian government is doing is actually the opposite of this. They are conveying very political, divisive messages, and also the language that they are using is pretty harsh, if not brutal, sometimes. I will mostly focus on these influence operations in the United States, the UK, and the EU, as I said. And first, I think that the origins of these influence operations are actually coming from a deep belief, both in Viktor Orbán and the Fidesz party's leadership, that they have been unfairly treated by Western European political elites and the so-called mainstream media. And in order to do something with this situation, they need a preemptive strategy by essentially building a network of fellow travelers, as they say, who will then defend the Orbán government against future unfair portrayals and attacks. The vehicles of this foreign influence operation are not so much the Hungarian state or its bodies themselves, but so-called government-funded proxies, think tanks, propaganda media, GONGOs or government-organized non-governmental organizations, astroturfing or front groups, and of course paid lobbyists. You are well aware of the fact that many well-known US or UK far-right or right-wing pundits have been visiting Hungary recently, and those two groups or those two front groups that have been paying for these visits are the Matthias Corvinus Collegium and also the Center for Fundamental Rights. These institutions both receive tons of public money from the government, but because of their role as an intermediary, the government has the opportunity to say that it's not themselves directly involved, of course, in these influence operations. The nature of these operations seem to be very partisan. So they are aimed at trying to convince already like-minded people to support the Orbán government. And also this is a very transactional relationship because it involves a lot of money. whether it's generous fellowships or lavish trips or other benefits or political favors. And since a huge amount of public money is involved, of course, it's worth scrutinizing these operations, especially for investigative journalists. When I try to list the aims of these foreign influence operations, I mostly found 6 goals that the government is trying to achieve. One is trying to divide the target country's political elite by sowing distrust, undermining bipartisan or grand coalition efforts, and creating a distraction by pushing an agenda that's deeply divisive, such as culture war issues, migration, white nationalism, LGBT, you name it. The other important factor is that these efforts are focusing on creating a network of like-minded political actors who are mostly on the fringes, of course, of the political spectrum, which could be useful in the future. However, it's worth to note that so far, forging a closer cooperation between these political actors on a global scale has not really come to fruition. The other thing is that shielding the Orbán government from specific types of criticism has also been one of the goals, especially when it comes to the fact that there are, or there have been, at least in the past, many remarks or many phenomena within the government or around the government which were labeled as anti-Semitic. So that's why there's a very special effort to court right-wing Jewish groups and also in Israel the right-wing Likud party's leadership. So whenever there's a new instance of criticism coming up against the Orbán government, then these conservative Orthodox rabbis or party leaders can come at the defense of the Orbán government. And of course, one of the main goals is to serve as a distraction, because when the Orbán government is trying to build relationships with like-minded actors, especially in the US or in the UK, there's one or more like 2 things where their positions don't really match, and this is when it comes to their position regarding the Kremlin, Russia, and China. So it's an elaborate effort by the Orbán government to try to distract from these issues and try to push migration or LGBT issues to the front so that no one will talk about the Orbán government's position on supporting, I don't know, some Chinese companies' expansion into Europe. And I'm just gonna mention a couple of case studies from my past reporting to show how exactly these methods are working. And I also want to emphasize that the United States is not just one of the main target countries of these foreign influence operations by the Hungarian government, but it also serves as a role model and also as a country from which the Orbán government is importing its methods, whether it's political strategy or actual political strategists working for the Republican Party, who then, of course, share their know-how with the Orbán government. So back in the late 2010s, the Orbán government hired a former congressman named Connie Mack to become the official lobbyist of Hungary in Washington, D.C. And what he mostly did was actually, during the Obama years, is trying to undermine official U.S. Government positions and also some U.S. government officials. So essentially, the paid lobbyists of the Orbán government tried to convince his Republican friends in Congress that Hungary is worth supporting and that they should speak out against the Obama administration's policies towards the Orbán government. Connie Mack did this for $5 million, which was paid to him and also to Századvég, a Hungarian think tank that was part of this consortium in charge of lobbying in Washington, D.C. And the result was that there were some congressional hearings organized in the House, in the subcommittee for Europe and Eurasia, where Republican congressmen were speaking out against Victoria Nuland, who was Assistant Secretary of State in charge of Europe, and also speaking out against then U.S. Ambassador Colin Bell. Both of them, both Nuland and Bell, were vilified in Hungarian pro-government media, but essentially these hostilities were exported to the U.S. Congress thanks to the lobbying of Connie Mack. Then when the Trump administration came in, interestingly, efforts to undermine U.S. government officials didn't end. Actually, they become more infamous because one of the targets of these hostile Hungarian lobbyings was Fiona Hill, who was a senior director at the National Security Council in the White House. And Connie Mack was trying to spread disinformation about Fiona Hill's ties to George Soros, where he received some support from Roger Stone and also Alex Jones. And it all led to the fact that Fiona Hill was harassed. She was receiving death threats, phone calls, and when she testified during the impeachment hearing of Donald Trump in 2019, she openly spoke about Connie Mack's efforts to try to undermine him. In the end, for some reasons, the Hungarian government did get away with these methods, and the meeting between Donald Trump and Viktor Orbán took place in 2019, and from that point on, the lobbying efforts of foreign influence operations were mostly focusing on the so-called Trump world. So it was not the Republican Party anymore that was the main target, but just the fringes or just the Trump side of the party. Of course, when it comes to exerting a foreign country's influence in the US or other countries, there are some legal challenges, because if you receive foreign funding, and now we see this actually playing out in Hungary in a different way. So when you're receiving foreign funding for political operations, then you can be labeled as a foreign agent. So in order to avoid that, the Orbán government actually learned political technology from the US, and instead of directly financing lobbyists or some actors who would exert their influence on behalf directly of the Hungarian government, they deployed some intermediaries, and that's where, for example, the Center for Fundamental Rights came in. This is a Hungarian so-called think tank, which has, I think, just this year received $5 million, 2 billion forints from a foundation that's financed by the government. And the Center for Fundamental Rights started sponsoring CPAC events. CPAC are, you're aware who they are. This is a gathering of conservative and more Trumpist people in the Republican Party and in their right-wing intellectual circles. So the Center for Fundamental Rights received Hungarian public money, started sponsoring CPAC, which then launched an event in Budapest earlier this year, and then in August, at one of their events in Texas, the United States, Viktor Orbán became one of their speakers. But since this intermediary was involved, when the Prime Minister's spokesman was asked what was the role of the Hungarian state in these CPAC events, he could deny that there was any direct involvement from the state, of course. And then there is, of course, the Matthias Communist Collegium, which has been inviting, for example, Dr. Carson to Hungary last year. who also aired his show from Budapest for consecutive days. He did this for an undisclosed amount of money for speaking fee. What we know is that another speaker at an MCC financed event, Daniel Prager, received $30,000 for just 2 appearances, for just some hours of work in Budapest. So we could only guess how much money Tucker Carson received, who's very influential still in Republican circles, especially among Trump people. And we also know that one of the other lobbyists, other lobby firms that were employed officially by the Hungarian government has been co-directed by the father, Dr. Carson. And we also know, because in the US you have to disclose certain documents about your lobbying efforts, that this company, among other things, organized an interview in Tucker Carlson's show for the Hungarian Foreign Minister for Greater Seattle. Of course, the father of Tucker Carlson and the lobbying company denied that the father had any involvement in this interview. But this just shows you the methods, how the money is hidden when the government is trying to essentially buy airtime for itself, for Viktor Orbán and for Greater Seattle, and for other pro-government pundits in US media. I mentioned the Matthias Corvinus Collegium, who just recently opened a new office in Brussels, because apparently that's another battleground for the Orbán government, where they are trying to influence public discourse. Previously, there were 2 other institutions linked to the government receiving money from foundations financed by the government that were operating in Brussels. One of them is the Civic Hungary Foundation. This is basically the party foundation of Fidesz. And the other one is the Antal József Knowledge Center, which is a more academic think tank, but still it serves as a legitimizing front group for the Orbán government. Because of various reasons, because of the Fidesz party's withdrawal from the European People's Party, and because of corruption issues that were actually uncovered by a colleague of mine. Both of these offices basically became paralyzed in Brussels, but now the Matthias Corvinus Collegium is jumping in to try to influence public discourse in Brussels. I don't know how much time I have left, but
actually you are running out of the time. Sorry.
Okay.
So maybe just a conclusion.
Yeah, and lastly, what I wanted to mention is the role of the UK, where the Orbán government is also heavily investing in trying to influence pundits, public intellectuals, former political operatives to essentially portray a more favorable picture of Hungary. One of the most prominent examples are the Danube Institute, which is run by John O'Sullivan, who used to be a policy writer and a speechwriter for Margaret Thatcher. The Danube Institute is also receiving billions of forints, and it was actually founded by the same foundation, the Lajos Batthyány Foundation, that is also financing the Center for Fundamental Rights, and which is basically essentially just disseminating public money. So to conclude, we see a lot of taxpayer money being poured into building this international network that is mostly aimed at giving out grants, fellowships, speaking fees to politicians, former politicians, pundits. But in the end of the day, the problem is, from a taxpayer perspective, that this doesn't seem to be very effective, because the people who are targeted to become witting or unwitting agents, foreign agents of the Orbán government, they are usually on the fringes within the public discourse in their respective countries, so they cannot really influence the general image of Viktor Orbán, neither in the US nor in the UK. And since some of these people are pretty controversial in their countries, it only reinforces some of the so-called unfair criticism of the Orbán government, that they're siding more and more with far-right and authoritarian players. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you very much. This was my presentation.
Thank you, Szabolcs, for your presentation.